Have you ever had one of those moments where after a conversation with someone, or maybe teaching a class, all of a sudden you stopped and you thought about what had just been said, and you think to yourself, wow, where did that come from? A moment that felt truly inspired. I've certainly had that myself different times, whether it was teaching theology classes, sharing my faith with someone, or a homily that goes really well. And I stop and I think, and I say, something bigger than me was at work here. And it feels good, but you realize you're in tune with something much larger. This Holy Spirit, this Spirit of God's wisdom acting through you in life, not for your own sake and not for having something intelligent to say, but to be of service to God's people, to somehow reconcile, console, unify, and build up this people of God in the world. That's what the readings of today are promising us, that if we are faithful to God, if we don't deny God, if we stay true to God, we will receive that spirit of wisdom. And so we have nothing to fear when life's challenges come about. Sometimes that can come in the form of the grace of office. I certainly felt that this spring. So prior to coming here to Holy Trinity, I was president of Fairfield Prep up in Connecticut. And this spring, like for everyone, was really challenging. And when we had all gone to Zoom, that I kept celebrating the Sunday Masses from Fairfield Prep's chapel so that people would have a familiar place and see a familiar face to be able to try to get through this coronavirus crisis that we're all going through. And honestly, I feel like I had some of the best homilies of my life, just week after week. Part of it was I felt this great responsibility to try to somehow, even in my own weakness, try to guide and pastorally support and lead a community going through a really hard, challenging time with so many unknowns. And so people talk about the grace of office, and I certainly felt a lot of grace to try to fulfill this office, this ministry that I had been called to at that point. Well, one great example of that also, of all the saints, is today's saint, St. Ignatius of Antioch, Bishop of Antioch, and someone who was facing a really difficult time at the end of his life before he underwent martyrdom for the church. Having been killed probably around the year 140, not entirely sure, but at the end of his life he was arrested in Antioch and brought in chains to Rome, where tradition has it he was killed by wild beasts in the Roman Colosseum. But during this long journey, and it seems to have taken a really long time, he had a band of soldiers with him, and he's not too happy with the treatment he's receiving. He calls them even, they're acting like 10 leopards at times, whatever that would mean, but it's probably not good. But the one thing is, they do allow him to see a lot of people on his journey. And so St. Ignatius of Antioch, the first Ignatius, is able to console and to build up God's people, even while he himself is suffering and knowing that he himself is going to suffer a horrible death because of his faith. And he's able to get off at least 7 letters, 7 epistles to different communities, one of them being the community in Ephesus. In today's first reading being St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Well, here is St. Ignatius of Antioch, some 75 years later, writing to the same community that Paul had written to when he was in prison in Rome, awaiting his execution. And so again, God has brought this servant, St. Ignatius, to be able to support and to build up the church going through difficult times. And he gets the grace to write some powerful pastoral letters that continue to form how we think about Jesus Christ and the church, and how he tries, like St. Paul, to build us up in faith, love, and a union of hearts and minds and souls united in this head, Jesus Christ. He's inspired with his words and what he writes to people, but he also gives some good practical advice. One that I particularly like and is relevant at all times, perhaps especially right now, is when he writes in his letter to the Ephesians that sometimes it is better just to keep our mouths shut. That could be the most inspired thing that we do. And he writes that it is better for a person to be silent and be a Christian than to talk and not be one. Very good advice, especially when we see a lot of those disputes, those fights between people who are professing their Catholic faith. You might see those online comments that get pretty nasty at times. It would probably be a lot more Christian of some folks to not hit that send button and to remain silent. St. Ignatius of Antioch goes on to say in that letter that it is good to teach if he who speaks also acts. There is then one teacher who spoke, and it was done, while even those things which he did in silence are worthy of the Father. He who possesses the word of Jesus is truly able to hear even his very silence, that he may be perfect and may both act as he speaks and be recognized by his silence. Today's readings do promise us inspired speech. Don't worry about what you will say, but to remember also that sometimes the most powerful thing we can say, we can offer, is our silence. There are those times when words fail us. There could be those times when the words have lost their value, particularly when we've hurt someone. And no matter what we say, doesn't matter. It's now, what are we going to do? How will we act to be able to reconcile us so that others can see that we are sincere about what we are feeling? There's those times when we have no words. We are with someone in their grief, in their hard times. And the most powerful thing we can offer is not words, but our silent presence, expressing our great love. In all that we do, may our words be inspired, may our actions be inspired, may our silence be inspired, trusting that, like St. Paul and like St. Ignatius of Antioch, our inspired speech, action, and silence are the way to faithfully live out this teaching of Jesus. Do not worry about what you will say, for the Holy Spirit will be our teacher.